The night their lives collided began like any other, ordinary, forgettable, unnoticed by the world. But fate had already decided it would change everything. She was driving home after a long, exhausting shift, her mind drifting between unpaid bills and unfinished dreams, when the rain started pouring harder than expected, blurring the road and muting the city's familiar lights. At the same time, miles away in the same storm, he was rushing toward a destination he wasn't sure he wanted to reach, burdened by responsibility and a life that felt heavier with each passing day. Neither of them knew the other existed, neither of them believed in destiny, and yet, at a lonely intersection where red lights flickered through sheets of rain, their paths crossed in a heartbeat that shattered the silence. Metal screamed, glass exploded, and time seemed to pause as their worlds crashed together. When she opened her eyes, everything felt distant, sirens echoing, rain tapping against twisted metal, the sharp sting of pain reminding her she was still alive. Through the chaos, she saw him for the first time, a stranger with fear in his eyes and blood on his hands, calling her name even though he didn't know it, refusing to let her slip into darkness. He held her there, shielding her from the rain, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep, as if keeping her awake might somehow save them both. In that moment, something invisible but unbreakable formed between them. Not love, not trust, but a fragile thread of survival. They were strangers bound by chance, by pain, and by an accident neither could undo. And as ambulances carried them away in opposite directions, neither realized that this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a connection that would pull them back together again and again, until both their hearts learned what it truly meant to heal. Recovery did not come gently for either of them. She woke in a hospital room washed in pale light, the steady beep of machines marking time she could no longer control. Her body ached, but it was the emptiness that unsettled her most, the sense that something important had been torn away and left unfinished. Faces came and went, doctors spoke in careful tones, and family offered comfort, yet her thoughts kept drifting back to the stranger from the rain. She remembered his voice more than his face, the urgency in it, the way he had held her hand as if letting go wasn't an option. She didn't know his name, didn't even know if he had survived, but the memory of him lingered like a question without an answer. Each night, as sleep pulled her under, she replayed the moment again and again, wondering why a man she had never met felt more familiar than anyone else in her life. Across the city, he lay in a different hospital, staring at the ceiling and replaying the same collision from the opposite side. The doctors told him he was lucky, minor injuries, nothing permanent, but luck felt like a cruel word. He couldn't forget her face, pale under the flashing lights, or the way her fingers had tightened around his sleeve as if he were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Guilt followed him relentlessly. He blamed himself for the timing, the road, the storm, anything that could explain why their lives had crashed so violently together. When he was finally discharged, he didn't go home. Instead, he returned to the intersection where it all happened, standing in the rain as cars passed by, hoping for something he couldn't name. It was there he made a quiet promise to himself. If she had survived, he would find her. Not to erase what happened, but to understand why fate had bound two strangers together so completely that neither could move forward without the other. Their reunion was nothing like the dramatic moment either of them had imagined. There were no sweeping gestures, no perfectly timed words, only hesitation and disbelief. She was relearning the rhythm of her life, moving slowly through familiar streets that now felt slightly altered when she saw him standing across the road outside a small cafe. For a moment, she wondered if her mind was playing tricks on her, if grief and recovery had stitched a face from memory into the present. But then their eyes met, and the world seemed to still in the same fragile way it had on the night of the accident. He crossed the street carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might break the moment, and when he spoke her name, learned from hospital records he had searched for days to find, her breath caught. Hearing her name in his voice made the connection feel real, undeniable. They talked awkwardly at first, exchanging apologies neither knew how to frame, each blaming themselves for something that had never truly been in their control. Coffee grew cold between them as the rain outside traced familiar patterns on the window, a quiet reminder of what had brought them together. What surprised her most was how safe she felt in his presence, despite knowing almost nothing about him. What surprised him was how easily conversation began to flow once the silence broke, as if the accident had stripped away the need for pretenses. They didn't call it fate, and they didn't call it destiny, but when they parted that day with a promise to meet again, both understood that whatever had started in the rain was still unfolding. They were no longer just survivors of the same moment. They were two lives slowly, cautiously intertwining, pulled together by something stronger than coincidence and far more complicated than chance. As days turned into weeks, their meetings became less about the accident and more about the quiet spaces it had created in their lives. They walked through parks and along streets neither of them had noticed before, sharing fragments of their pasts in pieces that felt safe to give away. She spoke about dreams she had put on hold, about a life lived carefully to avoid disappointment. He admitted to carrying expectations that never felt like his own, responsibilities that had shaped him into someone reliable but restless. In each other, they found a listener who didn't interrupt, didn't judge, and didn't try to fix what was broken. There was comfort in that silence, in the understanding that healing didn't require answers, only patience. Yet beneath the calm, fear lingered. She worried that their bond was built on trauma, that once the memory of the accident faded, so would the connection. He struggled with the thought that their closeness might be a reminder of pain she needed to leave behind, not a future she could move toward. These doubts remained unspoken, hovering between them during shared laughter and long pauses. Still, neither pulled away. Instead, they chose to stay, discovering that the accident had not defined them, it had revealed them, and as the walls they'd built long before the rain began to fall started to soften, both sensed the truth they were too careful to say aloud. They were no longer strangers, and walking away from each other was becoming impossible. The turning point came when the past they had been gently avoiding finally demanded to be faced. It happened on an ordinary afternoon that should have felt safe, when the sound of screeching tires on a nearby street froze her in place and sent a wave of panic crashing through her body. Memories of twisted metal and blinding rain rushed back, leaving her breathless and shaking. Before she could hide it, he was there, steady and calm, guiding her away from the noise and grounding her with a quiet presence that asked for nothing in return. In that moment, she realized how deeply she had come to rely on him, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that she could survive it. And as he held space for her fear without trying to diminish it, she understood that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about learning to live without letting it control her. For him, that day brought a revelation of his own. Watching her confront the trauma they shared forced him to face the guilt he had buried beneath concern and responsibility. He finally admitted what he had never said aloud, that he had blamed himself for the accident, believing that if he had driven slower, chosen another route, or left earlier, none of it would have happened. Speaking the words felt like releasing a weight he'd carried alone for too long. She listened, offering him the same patience he had given her, reminding him that their meeting, painful as it was, had also given them something rare: understanding. Standing there together, bound not by the accident itself, but by the honesty it had demanded, they reached an unspoken agreement. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side, not as strangers connected by chance, but as two people choosing each other in the aftermath of something that had changed them forever. The future they stepped into was not dramatic or perfectly planned. It was quiet, deliberate, and real. They learned how to exist together beyond the memory of the accident, building a life shaped by small choices rather than grand gestures. Mornings began with shared routines, and evenings ended with conversations that lingered long after the words were gone. The fear that once followed them softened into something manageable, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how precious it was to choose connection over isolation. They no longer needed the accident to justify their closeness. It had simply been the doorway that led them to each other. Standing at the same intersection months later, the rain had cleared, and the city moved on as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. She reached for his hand, not out of fear, but out of certainty. He squeezed back, knowing that the bond between them was no longer rooted in survival, but in love that had grown patiently, honestly, and without force. They were no longer two strangers bound by a single moment of chaos. They were partners shaped by resilience, trust, and the courage to heal together. And as they walked away from that place for the final time, they understood the quiet truth of their story. Sometimes the most meaningful connections are born not from perfection, but from the moments that break us open and teach us how to begin again.